that a little bit, and then we'll go on to the other.
Absolutely. So one of the things, and I'll give you from a Kenyan perspective, even as we developed and as we implement whether it's cross-border data transfer, or whether it's, we don't necessarily, I understand again that it is an African document, but it is not the go-to document that we'll usually utilize in terms of what is the best for us. So we'll make a decision and kind of see, well, does it align, does it not? One of the things that I've seen, and I think I pointed it out even when we had a session at the AU on this particular issue, is that yes, it was a multi-stakeholder. Yes, there were experts, but the practitioners that deal in it at the moment, the people that deal, say, for example, with us as the Office of Data Protection Commissioner, with a number of institutions that would have existed at that time, we weren't brought to the table. And so we're now rushing to come to a point where we're bringing member states on boards to say, hey, this is our data protection policy. We're now in our implementation stage. Is it fit for purpose? And many of the times it's, well, I mean, it's a good document. It is good. It is for Africa, but does it serve some of the political aspects and some of the practical aspects that need to be addressed? And many times you will find that nations will say, look, I mean, our priority is getting money. Our priority is investment. Our priority is putting information in our borders. And now I'm not even talking about broadly the non-personal data, because that's usually not in contention. But what is it in it for us that even as we're looking at the economy broadly, what is it that we can first look at for our citizens and then get to the point where we're then looking at it on an African scale. And I think that needs to be addressed at the core. Yes, a single digital market is great. Yes, if we come together as Africa, the 1.2 billion people that will be affected by a single digital market will increase our economic situation enormously. But for you to get to that stage, you must first say, okay, this is the benefits individually for each country, and let's look at what that aspect of data policy would look like and how it would apply to you on a bottom line scale, similar to how you would do for a private sector entity. I think there is a need for us to include governments in that sort of way so that there is a quicker uptake. It is not a legislative document. There is no binding applicability on it. And so we can choose to ignore it if we wish to. But the question is, how do you make it into a document where you cannot ignore, because it's not in the best interest of an institution or a government to ignore it? At this point in time, that for me is not quite clear. It's not quite there. There needs to be more emphasis on what it looks like for country level as well as Africa level.
Thanks very much for that very useful input. And I will ask Lisa and Luella to respond to that. And obviously, we did have the African Network of Data Protection Authorities represented there. And obviously, we can't get all the countries there. But part of the implementation plan is to work very closely with that body. And that's where I think, again, you know, some of the practical issues and the national issues can come to the fore, which obviously quite. So, you know, it is a very high level document, and one can understand that some of those national interests are quite difficult to capture and engage and to sell the document in that way. So that's it's very interesting. One of the organizations that have been involved very closely with this and dealing with you know, working with member states actually on the implementation, which will come to imminent, is of course part of their plan. So Dr. Tuwela, tell us how you know, you're working with it at the moment, whether it's provided you with a new instrument to you know, deal with this very fast developing area.
Thank you very much, Alison, and good morning to everyone. So I work with the African Union Development Agency based in South Africa. Our mandate is to support the African Union in the implementation of priority programs across the continent in line with Agenda 2063. And of course, the data policy framework is one of those instruments. Maybe just to give a bit of context in terms of the particular division that I work with. So it is called the Economic Integration Division. We work mostly on infrastructure and connectivity projects, on energy projects, and on digitalization projects, all of which are cross-border in nature and integrating. So the whole point is to really look at infrastructure that integrates and connects the continent. And this speaks to the whole idea of the AFCFTA, the whole idea of the single digital market, and the harmonization of all the different policies and frameworks across the continent. Having said that, I think in terms of the data policy framework and perhaps from our perspective, the data policy framework is one in a constellation of many frameworks around the digital transformation strategy. So our core aim is to accompany and support AUC in terms of once those frameworks are developed and adopted, how do they get domesticated? How do they get implemented? How do they then begin to start translating into impact on a national level? So we have to basically look at that whole constellation. And I think it speaks to some of what Rose is saying about, at the member state level, what's the value proposition? What's in it for member states in terms of them being able to actually take those frameworks, domesticate them, and translate them into meaningful strategies that actually achieve the national aspirational objectives. At the same time, of course, this is sitting in a context where you are dealing with perhaps what would be competing interests, because you have the national interest, then you have the regional interest, and then you have the continental interest. And one has to sort of figure out how to balance all those different interests. And I hear your point about the winners and losers, about the fact that not everything is going to work 100% for everybody in the same way at the same time. But I think the bigger goal is always the fact that we are aspiring to regional integration. And I think that that is important for the continent. We must never lose sight of that. And we must never allow ourselves to be detracted from that objective of regional integration. And we know that along the way, there will be winners and losers, but ultimately the continent will win. And I think that's where we need to really begin to think through, how do we make sure that as we're implementing, we are cognizant of those who perhaps may be on the losing side? And how do you then see, how do you work to mitigate those losses, mitigate the situations where others will be further ahead and will be the winners, others may be lagging behind and maybe considered as the losers? How do you bring all that together in a way that allows us as a continent to move forward? So those are competing interests. Those are the things that we have to deal and struggle with. But this is the reality of where we're at. I think we also have to understand that it's 55 member states. You're 55 member states, different socioeconomic contexts, different geographies, different political systems, different legal systems. Trying to harmonize all of that and get everybody to move at the same pace at the same time, I think is a mammoth task. And I think we have to also appreciate that. Having said that, I think it's important to appreciate the fact that things are happening, the fact that we are doing something, the fact that we do have frameworks. Imagine if we didn't have the frameworks, So at the level of the AUC, and I'm not speaking for the AUC, but I'm speaking as a member of the African Union ecosystem, I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of effort in terms of trying to get things going. And I think, when it starts now trickling down to the level of the regions and member states and the domestication, I think countries have to figure out how they are also going to support that process from the bottom up and then sort of inform even future iterations, future revisions. We will never start with anything that's perfect from the get-go, but I think we always have to start, and we have to start somewhere. Because I think the opportunity cost of us not doing is far higher than us doing something that needs to be perfected and refined over time. From our side, the things that we are supporting and working with, so on the infrastructure side, we have within the program for infrastructure development in Africa, some projects that are looking at data centers. And looking at regional data centers, because we see that as an important part of the ecosystem in terms of building the digital single economy and so on. So we have those hard infrastructure projects. We're also supporting, as I said, the implementation of the data policy framework, and that is an ongoing conversation, as Alison has said, in terms of unpacking who will do what exactly. How will we approach this idea of working with member states to build capacity, to put in place the different systems, and then to transpose all these things into whether it's the legislation, the institutions, and the regulations that are needed at the country level. So our role is really to help member states in terms of implementation, and we do that in a number of ways. Some of that will be through technical assistance that is provided to member states in terms of helping them to model through the different provisions. Some of that will be through very specific interventions on a country-specific level. We have not yet fully unpacked the DPF, to be honest, because this is something that's, in terms of implementation, I think a fairly new discussion in terms of trying to understand who really should take the lead on what. We have identified for ourselves the fact that we very much want to take a lead in terms of the data centers and really trying to harmonize and have a coordinated way of building data centers across the continent. And we want to model that process and that approach on what we have done in the energy sector and translate that into the digital space and see how do we have a collective process that identifies the right institutions within the countries in the region, and we all move together in terms of being able to develop a very coordinated way of developing and managing and operating data centers. And then associated with that will be issues of capacity building and other work that we will do with the various institutions across the continent.
Shweta, that's great. We're going to come back to some of those implementation issues, so I'm not going to pick those up right now, but we really are going to come back to those because I know lots of people, that's what they're really interested in. But at the moment, Maritha, if you could also just speak about your work on the framework, but then also how it's coordinating with the work that you're doing, and the utility of the framework for the work that you're doing, or some of the challenges that you might face that similar to what Rose has identified.
Thank you very much, Alison, and good morning, everyone. So I'm from Smart Africa, which is a Pan-African organization that's working towards the digitalization of Africa, working very closely with the African Union. I know it was part of the founding members of Smart Africa 10 years ago, and also sits within the governance of Smart Africa, fitting into the board, which is made up of the 39 heads of states of the different Smart Africa member states. So in terms of the data policy framework, I think it came at the right time. Based on the feedback that we're getting from our member states during our consultative activities, they were talking about a framework that covers all forms of data, so that as a continent, we have a guidance in terms of how we approach data governance overall. So I think it came at the right time. And then in terms of implementation, some of the issues that have been raised by Rose were always coming up. They were even raised when we were developing the framework. And I think, like you said, it's not about perfection at the start, but going as we go, adapting as long as we have that feedback loop. And I'm glad that I was part of the training in June with one of the RECs, where we were getting feedback in terms of the implementation plan. And coming back to what Smart Africa is doing in terms of the data policy framework, I think we are listed as one of the organizations that will support the implementation. And we have gone ahead to use the policy framework, the recommendations that came out of it, to support countries to develop their own national strategies. We've worked with Senegal. They've already developed their own national data strategy with support from GIZ. We completed this work in July, and we are moving ahead with supporting Ghana. So we see interest, a lot of interest from countries to move forward. And then the other issues, I think, that have been raised by Rose and are also acknowledged within the framework in terms of infrastructure, capacity building. We have a lot of projects that touch on those. And I would like to highlight, for example, the Smart Africa Digital Academy that works with policymakers to build capacities in various areas, including in terms of data governance. And another vehicle that we're using with the ECA and DIAL, the Africa Data Leadership Initiative, to build on peer learning. The framework acknowledges that all the countries are not at the same level. Some are far ahead, some are just starting. So how do we bring this together so that they can learn of each other? So there are various activities going. We will build as we go. We already, you mentioned the assessment tools, the capacity building that the AUC is doing. And I think when we move to the implementation part of it, we can then discuss more.
Great, thanks, Rose, because I was saying, I think sort of people are going to be interested in those implementation initiatives that are on the continent. But at the moment, if we can just speak about the framework so that we know what the kind of, framing utility of this is, and then we're going to go more into some of those implementation things, particularly the institutions who are responsible for implementation. But I think we now have, do we have Victor online now? Yes. Ah, good. Okay. So I think what we'll do next is we'll go to Olamide Babalola. I think Olamide is known to many of you. He's an award-winning and consummate digital rights and privacy and data protection lawyer in Nigeria. And I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit, just say a little bit about where you are located now in your organization, because what is on the website is out of date. And everybody's fuller bios are actually on the website if you want to have a closer look. But Olamide, would you just respond to that first question?
Thank you, Alison. So I wear about 2 hats now, 3. Currently, I'm lecturing at the University of Portsmouth, and I'm also a litigator, so I'm a researcher as well. So sometimes I want to introduce myself or describe myself along the line of what I'm speaking on event. So I see myself speaking here as a litigator, a researcher. So I would rather use my law firm. So I'm in my law firm.
Great.
Thanks. So just a little bit, they've said a whole lot of things. I'm going to speak from the perspective of a litigator and a researcher. So I see that Africans who are trying to regulate what we, with respect, do not understand. Data protection, whatever perspective you might have, whatever argument you might have, data protection as a concept is a European concept. I'm not talking about privacy, I'm talking about data protection. Because when you trace the origin, you trace it to Germany in 1970. Now, we should understand that the West, they've practiced, they have experimented, they have done trial by error. Even in the GDPR, there are some impracticable provisions in the GDPR. They are still finding out how to implement. Now, Africans, or as Africa, as a continent, we want to regulate data governance. Now, I've looked at so many African data protection legislation. Kenya, since South Africa, since Nigeria, since Zimbabwe, all of them. You would find a provision on cross-border transfer. We want to regulate cross-border transfer. On one hand, we want free trade, free flow of data. We want to improve business in Africa. On another hand, we have Malabo Convention that has been there since 2001 or 14, just became operational this year. We're not looking at it. Article 6, Article 14 of Malabo Convention sees Africa as one, sees the member states of the AU as one. Article 6 seeks to regulate cross-border transfer out of Africa, not within Africa. And that's the European style. The European by default, they agree by the GDPR, by the Data Protection Directive, that everybody within the EU is adequate in terms of data protection. And they call other people third countries. The Malabo Convention also calls people outside the EU third countries. We have a policy, we have a data policy. Now, first of all, to start with, if I ask all of us, what is the definition of cross-border transfer? We would have divergent definitions. Now, for some legislation in Africa, you will find cross-border transfer. Under the ACD model law, you will find cross-border flow. And I would prefer flow, because transfer sometimes can be confusing. We don't even know the parameters. I mean, you sent me an email to come and speak. I was in the UK. From where I sit, that's a cross-border transfer or a cross-border flow. Now, we sometimes look at transfer from collection. Yeah, I think one of the definition calls it the collection of data for it to be processed in a foreign land, or for the intention of processing. So if we don't first of all understand what cross-border transfer is or trans-border flow, then there's a problem. Then we can't regulate. Then that's one. Secondly, we have a convention, that is Malabo Convention, that is supposed to unite Africa on the basis of, from the perspective of data governance, data protection. And we need to first of all go there. I looked at this data framework. There's no definition of cross-border. So we can't even understand what we are regulating. That is one. All countries that have enacted, including Nigeria, section 41 or so, that have enacted data protection laws prohibit transfer of data out of their country. So meaning that Nigeria prohibits data from going to Ghana, our neighbors, prohibits from going to Benin. And we want business to flow in Africa. We want, what do we call it, free trade? It's inimical. I mean, it's contradictory. How do we do it? So the Europeans see themselves as one, and they now want to regulate outsiders. And why do they do that? I'm researching adequacy, and I call it a neo-colonialist tool. They called it that themselves, because what they wanted to do, which is initially, and it is still, I think it's still a good idea, they wanted to systemically make other countries to pass data protection legislation. And it worked, because everybody wants to be adequate. I mean, from the European perspective. But again, Africans, we're just copying it and pasting. Whether it is applicable or not, whether it is enforceable. Rose spoke about cultural realities. The way Africans will see privacy is not the way Europeans will see privacy. It's not the way Canadians will see privacy. And you even understand that even between the EU and the US, there's still this tussle around adequacy, because EU's, the American style of legislating privacy is different. It's not just having one comprehensive legislation. America has fragments. You have the Privacy Act, you have the CCPA, whatever it is, and all over. And at the bottom of it, they are still trying to regulate data protection in their own way. So if for every country, so we need to start from seeing Malabo Convention as, and that's really going to help the framework, seeing Malabo Convention as our roadmap. Whether, I mean, I've written articles against it, it has its own problems, so many problems, so many contradictions, so many laughable provisions, but let's leave it. Let's just work with that. I mean, I would always, like Nigerians would say, half bread is better than nothing. So let's work with what we have. We have Malabo Convention. Yes, let's begin to push the provisions. Let's see, because under the Malabo Convention, Article 14 says that for cross-border transfer out of Africa, that's when you need the authorization of the national data protection authorities. So if we begin to, because we don't even see Malabo Convention the way we should see, the way the Europeans see GDPR. Now, so everything is supposed to start from Malabo Convention. Then we can now begin to supplement it with these policies, supplement it with other frameworks we are going to develop to see how we can institutionalize it. To see, first of all, we need to look at all the countries. Why are you we need to ask ourselves, why are you prohibiting cross-border transfer? Why? I mean, because it's not even possible. It's not even practicable. Even in Europe, it's not practicable. I sit in Lagos and I buy airline, British Airways. That's cross-border. And Nigeria is not adequate. Yet, the provision is there. Now, I've seen in the Kenyan Act binding corporate rules, and I see it's just what we borrowed from Europe. And we ask ourselves, what is the practical value of binding corporate rules? I mean, does it really stop? No. So in Europe, part of the requirements or the factors that they consider for adequacy, one of them is rule of law. I mean, your rule of law has to be an independent data protection authority. Sitting from here in Abuja, we know that our data protection authority is not independent, cannot even be by design. It is the minister that recommends the appointment of a national commissioner. The minister can, in his wisdom, recommend its removal. Now, the minister, by the act, by the provision, the minister has the powers to supervise the national commissioner on issues of policy and their activities. So how are you going to be independent? So, and if we don't have an independent data protection authority, then it means that they can't really enforce these provisions against government authorities. Now, so we copied, no, I think Kenya, I mean, impressive a bit, they did not copy and paste adequate level of protection. But what they have is standards. I think they said they have standards. And of course, they also listed the standards. But the standards are the same with what they have in Europe. And what we keep copying, sensitive data. I think Kenya tried in terms of what should really be sensitive data. Nigeria, what we have in sensitive data is exactly what they have in Europe. And what is really sensitive to us, first of all, in Nigeria, is finance. In the UK, I want to buy anything, they call me, they ask me for my card number, I'll call it out. They ask me for the password, I'll call it. They ask me for the code at the back, I'll call it. I've been doing it for years, and nothing has happened. You dare not, Nigeria. Yet, we don't have that as a sensitive data. The one that is so ridiculous, I wrote against it, they removed it from the bill, was when they included sexual orientation as a sensitive data in Nigeria. It's hypocritical. Nigeria has a law that criminalizes same sex. So you fill any form in Nigeria, the only thing you will find is male or female. So we don't have any other thing. So there's nothing like sexual orientation, but we just copied and pasted. And I think she mentioned it. Another problem is we're too secretive with our policies, with our laws. You just want to hide it from people like us. You call us troublemakers. But at the end of the day, if we are able to make reasonable input, we will have a fantastic policy to work with, something that can really be, because we're talking about enforcement now. I mean, some of these provisions, they have data localization is another one. How do you localize data when you don't have infrastructure? I mean, how do you do that? So, I mean, you need to talk, you can't put the cart before the horse. Before you begin to put some provisions that you know the implementation are going to be extremely difficult. Nigeria has a provision also for data localization, and some clients will come and they would want to include that clause in their contract that you're dealing with it. And it's funny, a Nigerian company is dealing with a company in Cyprus. You're sending emails, you're exchanging correspondences, and in your contract, you're saying whatever services that company is going to provide is going to be localized in Nigeria. It's not even possible. I mean, because even their database is, where is it in the cloud? We talk about cloud. Where is the cloud? So, I mean, something is the cloud. In what country is it? So we say, well, maybe wherever their data center is, maybe that's where it is localized. Just maybe. But how many data centers do we have in Nigeria? And we want the African continent to grow. Then we need to begin to tackle, and maybe that's one advocacy or one litigation we're going to do next. We need to begin to tackle the provisions in all these laws on prohibition of data transfer. First of all, it is impracticable. Secondly, it is anti-progress. It is not progressive, because if we say we want to develop the African trade, then you can't restrict data from Nigeria to Ghana, even legislatively, before we talk about implementation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think these are exactly the kinds of issues that when we start implementing, we're going to face. I just wanted to make a few points before we go to Victor, just so that we can pick them up in the other conversation, and I can see the kind of, when the national issues come up, it really highlights some of the challenges. So there was a lot of discussion in the task team around where this data policy framework stood in relation to the Malabar Convention. And I think many of us have been in different forums, and the institutions of the continent have been pushing for it, to get to 13, 14, 15 countries, and now we're done. And now the law is so outdated that it needs a massive revamp. In fact, there was some discussion around whether we should stop lobbying for that and actually, start this being this part of this, bigger data security framework that we need on the continent. And I just want to say that it's a number of things that people have highlighted about how we were able to move ahead by saying, as you've pointed out, at least the Malabo Convention is a peg in the ground for us, even though it's so highly problematic and flawed. It is a peg in the ground, so that you'll notice the data policy framework urges countries to sign off on that while any kind of revisions are being done. And I think that is the nature of this work. What did allow us to go ahead, and you've highlighted some of the contradictions around the fundamental principles in this document of, you need a rule of law, you need independent institutional, you need institutional coordination and all of these kinds of things. And I think, why this guideline's been able to move sometimes with a little indecent haste is because we haven't been able to do the kind of consultation you might like. Europe did over 10 years to get the GDPR in place. We did over 6 months, is that it was able to just be this principled framework. It's not binding, of course, but neither is the convention, actually binding in terms of what we can do to enforce it anyway. So working with this was particularly to acknowledge the issues of data flows. But also strategically, I think maybe slightly different from what you're saying, is that, there was just, we need data flows. Everybody, any multilateral organization, any development bank will tell you, you've got to just free flow, and what we were acknowledging is that if you simply have a free flow of information, you will perpetuate the asymmetry of data flows on the continent, which means that, over 75% of data is actually going out the continent, and that there was an opportunity within a digital single market to actually leverage opportunities for Africans to, so you actually open up your public data for local entrepreneurs, for your public value planning, etc., and that sort of thing, and actually allow the continental data to flow so that you can then compete or effectively engage outside. So I think these are some of the issues that would be really nice once we've had Victor's input, and before Rose leaves, because I think you might just want to make a comment before you leave. So Victor, if you wouldn't mind, Rose has to catch a plane. I'm just going to ask Rose, she wanted to respond to something on this round. And Victor, we are coming to you. Please hold on.
So just to touch on what has been mentioned, I agree that there is a need for a document that we can actually utilize to then be the guiding light for data policy. I do not agree that it is a Malabo Convention, but I do think there's a lot of potential in the digital trade protocol. I think this might be our opportunity to right all the wrongs that were in the Malabo Convention. One of the things, again, as I mentioned, I sit in the negotiating team for the African the digital trade protocol, which again, commendable when it is done, first of its kind in the entire globe. I think it will be extremely beneficial. It also gives us opportunities to refrain the conversation when it comes to data protection, when it comes to open source data, when it comes to e-transactions and things like this, so that we can harmonize. But one of the things that we need to push for is an actual enforcement mechanism when it comes to development of interoperable or harmonized legislative provisions for open data, for data governance, and for data protection, which is something that we're pushing for. And the documents that were done, I think, for the AU data policy implementation, or I guess how to incorporate a data policy into the digital trade protocol are good, but they need to make provisions where some of these conversations are being had, because when you have experts sit around the table to develop a document that is not binding, it is very difficult to having practitioners such as myself sitting down and arguing about nuances of sensitive personal data. In Kenya, for example, one of the things that we don't have, which is something that is in the EU, or is political information. I will share my political affiliances or who I support freely. In fact, I will tell you before before you even ask in Kenya. I will give you details about my family even before you ask that information, because that's just who we are. So I think the digital trade protocol has the potential of actually influencing what data transfers, personal data, open data, what data governance generally looks like for Africa. And if it is done well, I think we'll have something that is dealing with the nuances of Africa, that is actually for Africa, by Africa. And so hopefully that support can be pushed in that way so that we have a document that is fit for purpose.
Thanks very much for that, Rose. Let me just pass the mic back. Thanks very much for that, Rose. I think there has been a lot of discussion of the trade protocols, digital services protocols. Sorry, I was plugging all of them. So I think it is an important discussion. I mean, I think there's this balance, because if you approach these things from the trade issue, there are these other tensions and these kind of, human rights and other protections that kind of, other important safeguards that fall along the way. But it's also interesting in the way that we've approached this, and this is another conversation, but that we've approached this in a kind of WTO way instead of as a European common market kind of thing. So we actually kind of going into this in hostility behind closed doors, not drawing on the expertise of the people who are actually doing this in Africa. So that's, that's another issue, but certainly they need to be complementary, and they are being, there's a process at the moment within the AU, I think again supported by GIZ, that is trying to make sure that the trade protocol does reference widely the Africa Data Policy Framework, these principles that I think we all agree on, but that need to be progressively realized. Victor, thank you so much for your patience. I think at this stage, if you could both comment on the framework, as I mentioned before, Victor is from KICTANET, one of the oldest ICT advocacy organizations on the continent, but operating out of Kenya. So Victor, if you could just speak to us a little bit from a civil society perspective on the framework and its utility or challenges.
Thank you very much. Sorry for joining in late, sitting in a bush somewhere in Nairobi. I think the framework is a good instrument in terms of providing a good basis for discussion and protection of the privacy rights in Kenya. And from a civil society perspective, I think we still have a lot of work to do in terms of getting buy-in from different stakeholders within the African continent.
Excuse
a number
me.
of times.
Can we have
Victor's
voice up, because we can only hear the translation, the English translation.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Need Victor's voice a little higher. Great, thank you. Victor, can you try again or go on?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yes, I was saying that we need to work on the buy-in to get more stakeholders on board, especially because it's a new instrument. We've seen the challenge with the adoption of Malabo in terms of, getting to the 15 number, which you had already alluded to. And the utility of the instrument is only as good as the number of stakeholders who make reference to it, who rely on it, and who use it on a regular basis to inform and shape data governance in the continent. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring in stakeholders on board and to engage them in terms of how can they practically implement the proposals and recommendations that are contained in the framework. How can governments, for example, what steps can they take to reform or revise or update their policies and laws? How can civil society organizations use these provisions to, create more awareness to members of the public in the countries where they occupy? to inform advocacy around ongoing privacy violations that are happening in their regions, to engage with accountability institutions in terms of how can we monitor the progress of change that is happening. How can they use it to hold governments, businesses, and other institutions accountable for their decisions in terms of when it comes to privacy. We are seeing a very huge influx of new technology products and services that are essentially relying on personal information to scale, whether it's in education, transport, social services, and even government programs such as digital ID that are spreading across. To what extent can civil society organizations and even governments themselves use this instrument to ensure that protection is entrenched within the new processes and procedures is going to be very important. And of course, more importantly, is for the communities and the people of the continent. For a long time, I mean, privacy had not featured in national agendas until fairly recent. And so having this framework could be a strong basis to enable communities to know more about privacy, to also be aware that there are certain actions that are being taken to safeguard their privacy at a continental level. Like one of the previous speakers had mentioned, African countries took up GDPR quicker than Malabo. And we've seen that in some of the privacy laws that have emerged. So it will be interesting to see to what extent African countries can take up this new instrument or document and integrate the new changes and suggestions that it is making into the policy and national frameworks. Also, for research, it could be a very good standard to inform research, whether it's by academia or civil society organizations, that can also inform further decision making. Like I said, we have very many products that are coming in, but the utility of the framework will only depend on how many people are actually relying on it for making decisions. So I think civil society organizations can have a very strong role to play, but they need to be engaged, they need to be involved, and more awareness and capacity building needs to be undertaken so that then people are aware of what this framework is proposing and the mechanisms for making its implementation a practical reality, as opposed to being another document that is nice to read, but nobody relies on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Victor. And as several people have made, absolute the measure of its success is its utility, is its reference point. Obviously, the potential for that to happen now with the domestication process is where hopefully the framework does call for multi-stakeholder participation in the domestication process. But as everybody's pointed out, that's subject to the national law, like it calls for independent regulators. It's the national level that we are going to require amendments to these laws, or if we can. To get the kind of participation we would like to see, and I know which civil society didn't have enough of in the framework process. So Victor, perhaps when we come round, because we now have had a much longer first round, but we have already touched on the implementation issues, but perhaps you could, in the next round, just include in your response possible make civil society participation in the domestication process, how you could see that happening in Kenya specifically, but also across the continent where you work, or across East Africa, certainly. Rose, thank you so much for your time and safe travels. Could we take some questions from the room? Thank you, at the back.
Thank you, Professor Gilward. Thank you, our panelists, for this very interesting session. I think this is very, very important in the aspect that we are doing very well in terms of formulating policy and frameworks, but implementing our own policies and frameworks is a challenge. And it's something we need to look at and address, because one of the biggest problems we face is our national rules and policies. We agree on something at continental level, but back home, we've got problems. So unless we tackle our national problems, remove the barriers, the challenges, which make it difficult to implement the agreed policies and frameworks at the continental level, we'll never move. And I thank our brother, Olumide. He highlighted some of the key issues which we face in Africa, the issue of copying and pasting from other parts of the world. So I think let's try to look at those problems. If you look at the issue of, another example is the free movement of people in Africa. We've got a very good policy in terms of allowing people to move freely in Africa, but nothing has been done to implement it. Only 4 countries ratified that protocol. So I think the biggest problem is how do we move from the current scenario, the challenges we are facing, so that we can implement whatever we come up with. So that's my take. Yesterday, I was watching TV, Nigerian TV. The people were talking, they were saying, there's so much coming out of research institutions and universities, so much output, but nothing is being implemented. Nothing is going to maybe prototypes, whatever, nothing. People are producing good papers, good results, and nobody's doing anything about that. Thank you, Professor Gilward.
Thank you so much. That's an important input. I'm going to just take a couple of questions and then we can get responses from the panel. And just to say, I think some people weren't in the room earlier, but a really significant aspect of this data policy framework is that it does have this implementation phase and the support for implementation at the country level through the capacity building assessment tools, and then the implementation done at the REX level and at the national level and by our NEPAD. So I think this is an opportunity to use these resources that are being provided for training, for institutional development, and those kinds of things at the continental level. Some more questions.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lekon from Digital Impact Alliance. My simple question would be, it would be nice to have your inputs and ideas on how we can actually measure success or progress, right? Because if there's no common understanding, right, of what success looks like or progress, then you have, various opinions and perspectives. So how can we have a common language, a common indicator of how to actually measure progress, either from an implementation perspective or an advocacy, or like he said, in terms of bringing what is happening in academia or in the educational institutions, amongst students, civic societies, etc. So yes, it'll be nice to hear your opinions around that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask for some specific inputs on that, but just to refer to the data policy framework itself. So the data policy framework, as I mentioned, is just the high level principles and objectives. What the implementation document does is actually, it's an action plan for implementation of those high level principles. So there are a number of strategies, multiple strategies, with the institutions who would be responsible, and currently the indicators that are quite generic and would take each country to apply that capacity assessment tool and then assess. And that's the very operationalized notion of success, because the vision and stuff of, the vision is a very high level, high sounding thing. So those are the actual mechanisms that we are, as I said, at the coalface at the moment in trying to get implemented. And of course, countries, the uneven capacity of countries to implement this, to take this opportunity, is also being supported. So countries can identify that they want to do this, but they need technical assistance to do it. But working on those indicators and getting agreement on those indicators is one thing. Basically, the framework at the moment is for member states. So the kind of indicators that you are speaking about maybe we want a different set of indicators of, to what degree states have included civil society in their, in their domestication or implementation. At the moment, it's just the member state, but that kind of operationalizing of what success, to get success we'll need to do is in the implementation framework, which is a separate second phase of the document, but it's also on the AUC website.
Okay, so thank you for the comments and the questions. So from what I see it, the ECOWAS Supplementary Act, for example, was also passed a long time ago, and it was even enacted, or it was adopted in Abuja here, and up until 2023, up until March 2023, there was not one case at the ECOWAS court where that document had been used, not one. So I discovered that in 2021, and I said, okay, we were going to test this law and even see what Nigeria's disposition or what Nigeria's activity has been. So in terms of measuring successes, advocacy, litigation, a lot that we did on making Nigeria or forcing Nigeria to enact a comprehensive data protection legislation. We actually took them to the ECOWAS court, and that was the first case actually, where we told the court to compel Nigeria to pass. For me, I would always like to take one step at a time before we get to the top of the building. Let's start from the base. Whether or not we are going to implementation, questions on implementation will not come until you have a document to implement. So these policies, yes, they're welcome ideas. Yes, let them continue to churn out the policies. Then we can now begin to think of how best to implement. For a long time, Nigeria did not have the political will to pass a comprehensive data protection law because there's so many interests, so many vested interests for whatever reasons. We kept on having failed legislative attempts. But for all those attempts, subsequently, we had gone to court, either to go and use what we had or to advocate judicially for the enactment of. So looking at Nigeria, where we are now, and that ECOWAS court judgment of March 2023, we would say we have made a whole lot. In fact, the court pronounced that from the existing framework that Nigeria had before the new act, that Nigeria was actually compliant with the ECOWAS Supplementary Act in terms of the constitutional provision of privacy, in terms of all the other sectoral enactment of privacy, which have not been used. So mostly we complain about implementation, but maybe we don't clearly identify our roles. It's very easy to look at the government. So for data protection, I even stopped looking at the Nigerian government because there's so many vested interests. But if we have a policy or if we have a document that we can also use, even if it is research, from where you sit, do the research. Sometimes somebody might come up and say, okay, let's even look at the body of work existing. Nigerian, the new minister now on information is trying to setting up a research team to look at policies and look at ideas and implementation of whatever we have or what we can subsequently have. So if there is a gap in research, and which is what Nigeria has, currently we have huge gap on research in data governance and data protection. I've been writing on it since 2021, and most of the time you see me referencing foreigners. You see me referencing foreigners so much. So there has to be something that we can work with in terms of research. So the part of success indicators will be the amount of work. What South Africa has on data protection and privacy is huge. I'm doing my PhD in privacy, and I'm relying on their judgment. I'm relying on their papers. I'm relying on their policies. But for Nigeria, speaking as a Nigerian, we also need to get to that level where we can see a whole lot, where you say you want to do literature review on a certain area of data governance or data protection, and you find a whole lot. Then advocacy, it's also a success indicator. Let's do a whole lot more of advocacy, and government can know that these people are agitating for this particular thing. Then litigation for lawyers. That's what we've been doing. And if we find any area where we think that the government is not even looking at, then we litigate and let them begin to think about it, even if it takes time. But I think it's going to happen one day. So those are the things. We look at where we were a couple of years ago and where we are now. Kenya passed their act in 2019, and up till this moment, I think they've passed about other 5 guidance notes. That's another point that we can use for implementation. We have these policies, they are like guidance. They are like, okay, so we don't even know what approach. We've been asking about sensitive personal data. Africa, maybe we would say, oh, Africa is also heterogeneous in terms of our culture. Maybe what is acceptable in Kenya culturally might not be in Nigeria, but we have some area of similarities. And these documents can provide guidance for the policymakers, can provide guidance even for the courts or even for the researchers on what Africans have agreed as a front on these certain areas. So I think the policies, it's the use that we put to them that matters. Let them be there, but do we understand how to use them? Are we intentional about using them? Because the research you talk about, in terms of data governance, data protection in Nigeria, we don't have so many. No, you begin to even look for people with academics on data protection, not so many. You begin to look for academics on data governance, not so many. I entered the field in 2019, and Kenya was going to do a project, and they came around and they found me. I mean, I would have thought that some people would have really, really developed the field before I entered the field. But that's where we need to start from. The research part is very critical. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I just want to add on measuring success. I think one of the areas that we can measure the success is to understand the impact of the data economy from an economic perspective. It's something that we have started to do at Smart Africa, coming up with a methodology to measure the impact of the data economy. But it's something that we've just done, I think, at the surface and still needs a lot of work to unpack. Is it something that we can quantify? And what are the parameters that we need to be looking at? And of course, it has been done in other areas, in other regions. But then again, to understand what it means from an African perspective, do we use the same parameters? Is it easy for us to get the data that's required to inform the measurement of the economy? So it's something that I think we can also try to focus on so that we understand it from a national point of view and then also broadly continental.
Thank you so much, Aretha. And if you just pass that to Tuwela. And we speak about these research gaps and these data gaps in isolation. So we go into an after access or digital divide thing, and then we say, oh, we've got no data, on basic digital indicators, access, pricing, that sort of thing. And then we've got, we speak data governance, but one of the big problems is that we don't have research universities. We have teaching universities, and people go overseas to do their research and those sorts of things. So and the money doesn't go run to the research locally. All the research we do at Research ICT Africa and UCT is, foreign funded money. So these are, very interlocked problems, and why the data policy framework says, we agreed as a task team and as the AU, for the AU, that we can't just deal with this data governance stuff. We can't just deal with data protection. We've got to deal with these underpinnings that you're speaking about. And now we have to work with our national statistics officers. We need to work with our universities. You need to get this evidence for evidence-based policy. Tuwela.
Thank you very much, Alison. Maybe to be a little provocative, the issues we have to ask ourselves is, when we implement these policies and these frameworks, what is the purpose? What is driving that? And if we haven't articulated for ourselves in our countries why we're doing these things, why we need these data policies, then clearly we will not implement. Resources are not allocated for implementation because the value proposition perhaps has not been clearly articulated for ourselves. Much respect to the partners in the room. I know FCDO is here, GIZ is here, but the question is, these things are always going to be partner funded. When the partner funding goes,
or churches in taking some time before service begins to giving software education of the advantage of the internet. That's a suggestion from Adebola.
It's just it's a never-ending conversation that we'll keep having that says we have a policy framework, we have a strategy sitting on a shelf somewhere.
In Nigeria, we have to note that we're multi-religious.
Start owning, really accounting
multilingual
the ways
in terms of our languages.
Approaching.
So if you're suggesting it to the church, you should suggest it to the mosque.
Thank you, Tuwela.
You should suggest it to the ATR, that's African Traditional Religion Practitioners as well, so that the spread is everywhere. It's not limited to a particular set of people.
Impetus is
Thank
there.
you.
You're welcome. Now, you mentioned something about health. So there's no way you are going to talk about health and you want to add value that you will not talk about the African health sector. And I'm not talking of medical doctors that went to school 7 years, no. I'm talking of African doctors who understand.
So we just
health.
really need to make sure that
And
it
that's the
does
truth.
become.
Anywhere you will see them coming back, there's the moringa.
And it's not going to be
You know,
easy, as I think
making
the
way,
panel has
it's here in
pointed out.
Africa. We have it here.
Victor, who's been
We need to
so patient,
understand how to do it. Now, where does
and
the
not
area of
very
community
visible.
network meet all of these
Victor,
people?
could you give us
Because
some
network
closing
allows you
comments,
to
in
understand
fact,
how to package yourself,
and
to
to
brand
respond to the
yourself, because
questions
there
in the
are
room as
people,
well.
different people. She knows how to brand. She knows how to build a website. You meet them in what we call Success Bridge from our own area, Success Bridge. And then they try to help your business grow. These are areas where the grass.
Thanks.
I think there's someone who is talking on the channel. We can't hear what you're saying.
The community network. You can't open an office and say you're all
Just
there
give
and
us a
we're
minute,
affecting the population if
Victor.
they're not very
Or
capacity
perhaps you
building.
can chat to us, so we.
Sorry, there's someone who's speaking.
Okay.
He's
Vic
a
might be
farmer.
outside.
He has a
You're
farm.
Unmuted.
He has
on
come to
yours.
learn how to do web design. He's learning and he's getting somewhere. You want to become a social media strategist. The three of them have something in common.
The AFRISIC support needs to mute its channel.
They can help build the social
Victor,
media
can
of
you
the farmer.
make sure that you're
They can help
unmuted?
build the e-commerce website of the farmer. The farmer knows how to.
Yes, I'm unmuted, but someone is speaking from the
Like a connection.
AFIGF support is speaking. Maybe it is interference from another room.
Sorry, I don't want to close off. Victor's been so
Okay,
patient.
we can hear now.
Through the conversation
So I can hear you now. So you can ask.
Victor, we don't hear you. Can you hear
That's
us?
one. The second question.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, we can't hear you.
Found it. Now, I run a faith-based organization. Yes.
There's another group that is speaking on the channel.
Attacked myself.
Can you check? Can you see if you take
on
your
our
earphones
faith-based
out?
platform,
Actually,
our faith-based community network.
I don't know if you can hear me. There's someone who is speaking on the channel.
Okay, individuals. So when a Christian walks in,
Victor,
is this something like Christian?
Okay, maybe I will check, but someone is speaking on the channel, so we can't communicate.
People. We have already created an avenue for faith-based organizations to easily come to us and understand what we do. But we keep all faith activities out of the community.
So you're unmuted, I'm assuming.
Why? Because we don't want a clash. Because as a Muslim comes in, he also sees a Christian.
I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
I just put up a little bit of volume.
You can take the mic somewhere very close.
Can you hear me?
Carry on, Victor.
But this.
That means we already.
Yeah, there's someone who is speaking. There's a bit of
okay, Victor, we're just trying to check on our side here. Just give us a second.
Accept others who feel like, oh, I know how to do this particular drug. Well, I may not tell you the secret, but I just want you to market it for me. So we begin to call those other members who are into marketing on social media. So this person needs you to marketing. He will pay you. And
I think we've got the other room.
Mediate between those two sets of people. So the community network platform is a big success ground that can bridge people from one aspect of their life to another, irrespective of your faith or your creed.
The translation wasn't good.
Can you hear now or still?
While we're waiting for Victor, because we are over time, were there any final
questions? Very, very successful. We're in more than one country. We have 1,000.
Sorry, we seem to have the translation from another room, Victor. Was there any final question from the floor? Yes, please go ahead and let us squeeze time before we're thrown out the room.
Okay, I think my voice carries.
I don't know if there's translation for this room, actually, but there we go.
Good morning, all. I missed some of the presentations, but there's a question and that has been raised about what the Malabo Convention is. And like you mentioned, well, it's a peg in the ground. But my question is, with all that has been said, the issues and how long it's taken to adopt, do we see any value in actually sitting down, whether at the level of the African Union or as African countries, sitting down to actually redraft and maybe unbundle that convention so that we work on an instrument that is real and works, or we want to carry on, pushing people to ratify the Malabo Convention, even though we know it is impracticable, it is unworkable? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We did have some discussion on that. And I think we were just capturing some of the discussions that were had at the time. I think the broader point that was being made is that, of course, the Malabo Convention only covers data protection and cybersecurity. And the issues that we're dealing with here are the much broader issues of data governance. Those are, of course, critical issues. I'm not downplaying them, but the convention would only address some of the issues we're trying to deal with. And what it's not able to do, and I think Rose was suggesting might be done through the trade protocol, is that it would address some of the economic issues about, data value creation on the continent and, in support of the single digital market and economy. That the guidelines provide a framework for, obviously non-binding, a whole lot of things in terms of implementation and enforcement that are much more complex. But those are also the things that allowed this to move as fast as it did, because it's only a principled agreement with, acknowledgement of the realization towards it. But I think there are lots of discussions on the continent about the reframing of that, the redrafting of that, the making it up to date, making it align with now global governance issues on this, right, that it's also out of date with. But then also some of the very practical points that were mentioned around the tensions between open data flows and data sovereignty and localization. Do we have Victor online? Victor, can we give you the last word, please?
I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yes, we can. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. I think in terms of closing, I think we need stronger multi-stakeholder